Bonjour.
Hello everybody, welcome for this session on sustainable development and inclusive development. There are two topics, one which is absolutely obvious and another one which is slightly less obvious, which is who's going to foot the bill? Who is going to pay for the investments, the cost of investments to attain sustainable development? So the fact that these two subjects are linked is not new. Since 1997, since the Brundtland report, these subjects have been tied in together. Let me just give you a definition. Sustainable development responds to the needs of the present, taking care of the most impoverished, without compromising the options of future generations to satisfy their own needs. So we are going to talk about these two subjects. So why are we talking about sacrifice and cost? Why are they so essential? Well, because of social ethics and also politics. We have to bring the working classes along in this combat for sustainable development. And sustainable development is not only going to be obtained by the rich countries. If we hope for it to be efficacious around the world, well, then it will have to be an effort provided by the entire world. And if we listen to what those yellow vest protesters in France were saying, and I think they are well represented in this round table, and perhaps in the audience as well, they were saying, yes, that's all well and good, we will make efforts, but let's start by you doing the efforts, because your consumption and, in fact, your carbon emissions are much higher among the rich than among the poor. The same applies to countries, the developing countries. We've had a whole series of COPs where we've been saying, yes, this is all well and good, but the industrialized countries have been the biggest emitters of pollution in history, so you are the ones that have to make the effort, and we would like you to help us, the less developed countries, in our efforts. So there are two different goals. Firstly, that is to make sure that efforts are minimized. We don't want everyone to be sacrificing heavily. And then we also have to wonder how we can fairly share out the burden. And the burden, which will need to be paid in a one-off payment. It's the cost of investment to enable sustainable development. So the answer to the first question is quite obvious for an economist. Our economies are based on the market and the state. They're based on votes and the market. And so we need to combine both. We need the state and the market. The state through planning investments, and it's important not to imagine that the market tools, which are carbon taxing, the emissions market, let's not imagine that those tools are old-fashioned now. Well, we've hardly used them at all. The answer to the first question is obvious. It becomes a bit more complicated when you address the second question. How do we go about organizing that sharing of the cost of these investments? I'm going to make some suggestions which may be discussed among the panel members and the audience members. The first idea is, for political reasons and ethical reasons, it would be a good idea to have a rule whereby during the next 30 years, the living conditions of the most impoverished do not worsen. We must commit that their lives do not grow worse, either nationally or internationally, and to define the level of who are the impoverished. I suggest we take a cut-off line, the median, those people who have a revenue which is below the median revenue, which is the 50% of the poorest members of the population, will not see any damage to their living conditions during those 30 years. So they must not have worse living conditions. The cost inside a country has to be shared, not necessarily in a proportional manner, but it must be shared by those whose revenue is above that median line. There are some more complex issues when it comes to the international stage. How do we organize the sharing of this cost, internationally speaking? I'm going to throw an idea out there. Africa, which is the closest continent to Europe, only emits 4% of pollution, Europe 8%, and I think it would be a rather noble gesture for Europe to help Africa and to take that cost of sustainable development in Africa under its wing. It's much easier to start with a clean page. It would be a rather noble gesture for the biggest polluters, who we have been, would be the smallest polluters, or we would help the biggest. It would be great for the biggest polluters to help those who pollute the least to become sustainable. So to develop all of these subjects, we have a panel with some very noteworthy people. We've got Elisabeth MORENO, who will be the first to speak. She'll have 5 minutes to speak. She's the former Secretary of State for Gender Equality here in France. And then I will hand the floor to another minister who's from Singapore. We have the Singaporean Minister for Transport and Trade Relations, Mr. ISWARAN. Then I'm going to hand the floor to Paul HUDSON, who is General Manager of Sanofi. Then we have 3 representatives of the banking world, the financial world. First of all, Philippe HEIM will take the floor. He is at the head of the executive board of the Banque Postale. Then Nicolas NAMIAS will take the floor. He is general manager of Natixis. And finally, I will hand the floor to Maya ATIG, who is at the head of the French Banking Federation. So there we go. You all have 5 minutes to speak, and then we will see if there are any questions you wish to put to one another, and then after that I'll open up the debate to include the floor. So kindly respect your 5-minute slot. Madam Minister. Thank you very much, Professor Tranois. I could speak for hours on this subject. I'm not going to be keeping my eye on my watch, so do tell me when my time is up. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a delight for me to be here with you and to talk about a major subject. It really is important, this subject, because 10, 20 years ago, when we were talking about inclusive growth and sustainable growth, those were seen as things which were nice to have. You had to first of all think about growth, and then if it was inclusive, and if it was done properly in a sustainable manner for the environment, then that was all well and good. But it was not the #1 criterion. And I believe today things have completely changed. It's no longer just nice to have, it's must have. Priority, there is an absolute urgency here, and let me explain why. Economic insecurity is one of the most frequent worries among human beings. We don't really talk about it very much, but it gives us an idea about the economic urgency, the ethic and psychological urgency inherent in sustainable inclusive growth. Let me give you a very recent example. 2 weeks ago, perhaps some of you may have heard talk of a drama which happened to Melilla. Melilla is a place in Spain where the borderline is guarded quite severely to stop migrants getting into migrants. There were hundreds of migrants who turned up at that frontier post 2 weeks ago, and there was a terrible drama which caused the death of 23 of them. A lot of them take tatty old boats to sail across the Mediterranean Sea, and they've got a 50% chance of getting to the other shore. And if they do manage to get there, they're either sent back home, whereas they've paid colossal funds, the amounts of money that all of their family has collected together to do that crossing, or they die while they're at sea, or they die when they reach land, or occasionally they'll reach land and they get sent back home. So that is a trauma, that is a real drama. But it's not only that question of immigration, which will grow in coming years. Because you can stop 1,000 people who are trying to immigrate because they're hungry, because they're trying to escape war, because they're trying to get away from global warming. We can stop 1,000, you can stop 10,000 perhaps, but you will not be able to stop 10 million migrants. So by 2050, Africa will have the biggest active population in the world. 35% of the world population will be African. This situation implies that it can be an opportunity, because we know that Europe's population is aging today, as is the case in the West in general. Or it could be a total drama if these populations do not have the means with which to take their fate into their own hands, and if the situation continues. But I'm not only going to referring to Africa or developing countries. I'm also going to talk about two other parts of the population. Wherever they are in the world, these are left by the wayside of growth. I'm talking about women, which constitute 50% of the world population, but which today are still finding it difficult to get recognized on the economic market, and also youngsters who despair at the idea of whether or not they'll be able to find a place in the world. Or youngsters also address metaphysical questions about what on earth the future may hold for them. And so today, in our today's world, where there are multiple crises, we've got the environmental crisis, economic crisis, social crises, and political crises. If we don't solve all of these problems collectively, then even those who manage to do okay, that 1%, or the 10% that share 90% of the planet's wealth, they will find themselves in a very worrying situation, whereby each individual will be suspicious of the others. I was lucky enough to live in South Africa, where inegalities are explosive. You know what's going on in Brazil. On one side of the street, you'll have a lovely villa with a swimming pool, and on the other side, you'll have a favela where people can't fall asleep, they don't eat enough today. These inequalities also exist in the OECD countries, because over the past 10 years, we have never seen so much inequality in the OECD countries as in the past 10 years. I believe, therefore, it's absolutely urgent for the entire planet to make sure that the planet, well, which doesn't have a plan B, we all know that what the consequences of this galloping growth is going to be. But if we grow to the detriment of the planet, then the question is, how can things possibly go well? We have to make sure that all human beings have the impression that they can live with dignity by contributing to the development of the planet and developing themselves and enabling their families to develop. Thank you very much.
From Singapore, thank you.
Thank you very much. Bonjour, everybody, and please permit me to speak in English. First, let me say it's a real honor and privilege for us from Singapore to be represented at this event and on this panel. I'll keep my comments brief. I think firstly, we are at a point when we are dealing with an unprecedented confluence of challenges. We're emerging from 2 years of economic and social ravages brought about by COVID. We are dealing with geopolitical tensions and the eruption of war. We are also dealing with supply chain disruptions for a variety of reasons. And in that context, I think globally and at the individual country level, we do need to think about what is the appropriate economic and political policy and strategy that we should be adopting. So I'll make 3 points on that. The first is, I think it's important that, especially at a time like this, we resist the tendency to look inwards, but ensure that we maintain global international connectivity. And we think this is important because when we talk about, for example, even something as basic as supply chain resilience, diversification is an essential part. So it's not just about onshoring or reshoring, it is also about diversifying our linkages. And so we have embarked in Singapore on free trade agreements, and we continue to do that even in the past 2 years. So we concluded an FTA with the EU, and we continue to do this with many other countries and regions. The second point I want to make is we need to think about new ways of growing for the benefit of our people. Because it's not just about doing business as usual, but it's about how we go forward. One is obviously in the digital realm. Digitalization is everywhere, and we need to ensure that our businesses, our economy, and most importantly, our people are plugged into this so that they can realize the opportunities fully. And so we have embarked on digital economy partnerships with many countries, Australia, New Zealand, Chile. We have initiated a dialogue with the EU, and we want to be able to do more of this to create those digital bridges. But the other dimension of this is what we call the sustainable objective, and therefore green economy agreements. This is really where we can come together as like-minded partners and countries to see how we can ensure that the growth that we pursue for mutual benefit is also a growth that is sustainable, that is green, and that does not harm the future of our planet. And then I will come to the last point, which is we want to ensure growth, we want to ensure that it is sustained and sustainable, but most importantly, we must ensure it is inclusive. Because even as we pursue strategies of internationalization, what we must recognize is that the impact on our companies and on our people will be differential. So we have to ensure, for example, that SMEs, the small and medium enterprises, are well equipped to participate in this growth, whether it is going overseas to new markets, whether it is plugging into digital platforms, developing their capabilities in that regard. And I'd be happy to discuss the range of policies that we have embarked on in Singapore in that regard. And similarly, we must invest in our people, because unless the people feel that they have not just the opportunity, but also the skills and capability to participate in these new opportunities, then it will be as they would say, a Pyrrhic victory. What's the point of growth if you cannot benefit the people at large? So this is why investing in training, capacity building is key as part of this overall strategy. So even as we pursue external linkages, new pathways, digital and sustainable growth, it is critical that we also complement that with important domestic economic policies that support the capacity of our small and medium enterprises and also the capabilities of our people. Thank you very much. Merci.
Paul HUDSON.
Paul Hudson, the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
To everybody, and thank you for joining the session. I think one thing is absolutely for certain, and we've discovered it over the last 2 years plus. It is impossible to have a sustainable future without a healthy world. We've seen real-time a proof of concept on a global scale that is very clear to all of us that if you can't have a healthy workforce, you can't deliver an economy and you can't get into a sustainable cycle. We saw it firsthand in the pandemic. I think we could see governments wrestling with the equation that was unsolvable about how to protect people from COVID and at the same time how to maintain the economy. And it was a wake-up call for many governments. It's a wake-up call for most of the world to recognize that if you're deprived of health, the implications are simply catastrophic. We know and we saw in 2008, after the economic crisis, that investments in healthcare declined significantly as countries struggled to reconcile budget deficit. We also know at the same time the world is just aging and the prevalence of chronic conditions mean there is more and more need for hospital services and supportive care. So the consumption of health is increasing, the budgets available have decreased, even though we see real time how important these things are. There's a very interesting article in the Lancet, a well-respected medical journal, that points out that from 2030, because of climate change, an additional 250,000 people will die each year for the next 20 plus years. They're deaths that could be avoided. At the same time, we all know, and I think you made the point admirably, is that sadly, those deaths will come from those who are on the wrong side of the equality equation. Those will be the people that had simply no choice. Now, for us, we recognize as a healthcare company, and I think healthcare in general, that we need to work as a public-private partnership to do things the right way. It's not possible for one actor to solve the challenges of providing a healthy world. And we are ready, if you like, for that challenge. Just let me give you a statistic. The average person in their life will create 16 tons of carbon emission, the average person in their entire life. If that person has diabetes, it'll be 48 tons. So how can that be 3 times as much? Simple. The consumption of hospital services, jumping in the car, going to see the doctor, the consumption of medicines that are required to be created by companies like ours. There is absolutely no choice but to make the populations healthier. If you're pre-diabetic and you get good coaching and good nutrition, you may not become diabetic. That's your battle. But on a global scale, that is a 3x saving in carbon emissions just because you made a better choice. There is so much that we need to do. For me, I lead part of the Sustainable Markets Initiative, a recalibration of what it's like to deliver healthcare. And I'll go to COP27 to try and present the ideas for saying virtual health is better for the patient and better for the environment. Big hospitals in big cities are a legacy artifact of healthcare systems that need to be modernized. That if we don't come together to do something meaningful and think that it's okay to underinvest in health and then watch people struggle and develop disease, we lose on 2 fronts. We lose in terms of life, we lose in terms of inequality of healthcare delivery, and of course, we damage the environment repeatedly. It's a bit of a wake-up call post-pandemic to say, we need to solve it together, we need to solve it now, we need to save lives, and we need to recognize that the existing model is simply just too broken. So we'll lead it from our side in Sanofi. Only 9% of our own emissions come from making medicines. 91% of our emissions come from scope 3. 91%. So we'll solve what we can on our own, and then we'll work with our partners, as we hope healthcare systems and healthcare companies will do, to try and do something meaningful and recognizing that if it's not now, then I simply don't know when.
HEIM, vous avez la parole maintenant pour 5 minutes.
HEIM, the floor is yours for 5 minutes. Thank you very much, Alain. So I will focus on 3 points. If there's any doubt. Well, there's an urgency. The second point is that we need to get organized. This transition will have an economic cost, a social cost. And I think we have to be extremely clear, and we have to steer clear from the vision of the transition of like something that will be simple and happy, but it'll be costly. And secondly, we have to be in motion. This means for each of us to move towards a just transition, an acceptable transition. I don't think that a lot of people in this room will be against the fact that there's an urgency we're faced with. There was the leader of English bank that tried to defend this thesis a month ago with the success we heard. No. Just to go back on a few elements here, today we've measured that climate warming since the last 2 centuries is at 1 degree. If we do nothing, we'll be beyond 2 degrees. And 100% of this warming is of human origin. You all know the figures that are scary in terms of the depletion of the biodiversity. We really have to act. And I think it's something that doesn't raise a debate. No need to spend time on this. But there's now the question of the transition itself, which will have a cost. Obvious cost, the investments we'll have to make at the European level. According to the Commission, it's 350 billion euros of annual investments. It's considerable. It corresponds to the Danish GDP. If we do nothing, we'll have additional costs still. The IPCC have considered that a bad transition will have a cost that is 10 to 20% higher in terms of GDP. But having said this, I think we need, like in line with what you said, I think we have to make proof of lucidity. Scarcer energy, more expensive energy will probably hinder our business models. It will have an impact on our social balances. The subject is not degrowth. We're not there yet. But there will be an impact on the potential growth, on the creation of value in time. This is something we have to integrate. And the cost of a more expensive energy, it's not properly distributed around the population. And this is something it's equally distributed. It's important to take this into account because behind this is one key issue is the social and political acceptability of what we will, acceptance of what we will undertake. We saw the yellow jacket movement. We saw the reaction of African countries who say, you know, us, those big international banks who no longer finance oil and gas operations. Some African countries suffer from that. And to conclude this, I would say that we need to steer clear from an ideal perception of transition or vision of transition. We have to accept things realistically. We have to set ourselves in motion consequently. So what to do? I think we can be proud in Europe all together. We can be proud of having a collective organization that is massive, especially if we compare to the US. Global, systemic, and I find quite encouraging. We can, of course, talk about the taxonomy and the time it took to achieve this, ex-GNU program and elements like reporting elements, like everybody to measure our results. Like Paul mentioned, the scope 3 is really the nerve of the war. I mean, it's really the most important. The fact that we can publish the impact of our actions, it will help us to be in line with Scope 3. And there's another point that is lesser known is the BCE will integrate the climate constraints in its monetary policy, and notably in the purchases of corporate obligations. And it will introduce conditionality, which will have a strong impact on emitters, because we will have to hold to trajectories that are set. The financial sector, be fast because I'm taking time here, we're in a specific domain because we're at the crossroads as investors. We grant credits through the management of assets and insurance activities. So the stake for us, the challenge, is not only to make our results greener. The objective is to change our governance methods, our KPIs, to make sure that the transition is perceived as an element of performance, that transition be perceived as a corporate performance indicator, and that everybody agrees with that. And secondly, the idea is that our customers become actors of this transition. So to open a range of products that enable them to act positively in this sense, whether they are individuals or enterprises. And my conclusion, I think I was told that I'm done, is what's important is that we have to make sure that our compatriots in France and abroad agree with us and are on board with us in this process. Thank you very much.
Philippe NAMIAS.
Philippe NAMIAS now. Today, I will talk on behalf of Nicolas NAMIAS. There was a bit of a mistake on the name. So anyway, I'm really happy to be with you and to talk about this topic, the topic of transition. And the topic, I'm going to be talking about the transition from the point of view of a financial institute, how we accompany this transition. So I would like to focus on three simple ideas. First of all, I'm convinced that the financial institutions are there to be a catalyst for this transition. Second element, the concern that we should have is that, and this is the discussion we had this morning with an acceptable transition and the financing of this just transition. As we said, things are not simple. There are some certain number of topics that correspond that we need to take a back. Anyway, first element, I'm convinced that financial institutions are there to be behind these transitions, support these transitions. Our role has always been to finance projects, our customers, of individuals, of corporations, but our role is to finance their endeavors. And I think, that's why I do this job, is that if we weren't there, these projects wouldn't happen, and the transition wouldn't happen. I'd like to think in the opposite way. So how does a household, for a family, how can it purchase an apartment, a house, without banks or financial institutions? Wouldn't be possible. Or it would be a world of inheritors. And also, how can an enterprise invest in transition without banks or financial institution? It would just invest its results, its profits. So it means that without a financial institution, the world is just static. I'm convinced that our role is to make and to accompany a dynamic world, accompany the transition. That's the first aspect, and that I think is pivotal. Once this said, the idea is, what is a just and acceptable transition, and how, for an institutional organization? I propose to have two ideas. First of all, they are not ruptures, okay? Ruptures will add complexity, injustice. We have to be in transition. The second element is that we have to make sure through our financial solutions to accompany all the actors in the sector. Take an example. Environmental transition. How do we position financial institutions? How do I position Natixis to accompany this transition? Banking-wise, talking about as a banker, two things. First element, we have to make commitments to accompany transition. So we are committed to have a portfolio temperature of our results. Each time we make a loan, I allocate a temperature to this loan, and this gives me result temperature. I have an objective, 2.5 degrees by 2024, 1.5 degrees in 2050. Today we're at more than 3 degrees. It's normal. It corresponds to the global temperature of the economy. The major topic today is how I accompany this transition, how I adjust my loans to make my results go from 3 to 1.5 degrees. That's the constraint. And it goes through a dynamic positive position aimed at developing tools, developing financial solutions to accompany our clients in this transition. That's on the banking standpoint. For the investor, same reflection. The fair transition is to enable to accompany our clients in their projects, and we have just invested in a management corporation that is developing a new financial technique. Few seconds on this topic. I find it a very good example. We call it the blended finance. It means that the management committee, which is called Sun Funder, that we are integrated in Mirova. What does this management company do? They mix two types of investors. One investor that will take the first losses, the first risks, and often they're foundations, and investors that have more traditional risk appetite. Through this, we'll have a lever enabling, since I have a first investor that's ready to take the first losses, accept the first losses, I have a leverage effect and I can finance more risky transition projects. So there are solutions for the fair transition. Third point, and let's not be naive, we have elements to deal with. I think we have two elements to tackle. First is today we are supported. The idea is that we have an offer transition that is driving us. It's supported by enterprises. It's driven by financial institutions. We are in an offer transition. So the idea is that this transition will not happen sustainably if we don't accompany this offer transition that is anchored by a demand transition. The second major element, if we want to anchor the fair transition in time, is to anchor it through the crisis. We see that the crises come one after the other, and they are becoming sort of like a new norm. What is the natural reflex for each crisis? The natural reflex is to go back on our commitments. We take commitments when things are going well, and the crisis questions these commitments. So we have to maintain our commitments in times of crisis because it's becoming a new norm. So there's a trajectory. It's not easy, but there is a trajectory for this transition.
Notre dernière intervenante.
Final speaker, Maya ATIG. You've got 5 minutes also. Thank you very much. Hello, everybody. Yes, in such a meeting such as this, we should have at least a quarter of our roundtables that pertain to this subject. So we are currently getting into agreement that we have to act more fast. As the speakers already said, we're not here to talk about the observations. We've made those observations. Now we have to act, and act quickly. For several years, the mindset was back to back, saying it's not me, it's down to the other party to act, it's easier for the other party, etc., etc. Why should it be me, whereas I don't really pollute very much? But we're leaving that mindset behind us very quickly. I think nobody nowadays would speak like that. The third element is this word which has entered into the French debate, which at the end of the day stems from what has been mentioned about European developments, and that is the word of planning. I think the return of the word planning means that we can get around the table and work together. So why is it so important? Well, at the end of the day, we need to take collective decisions, and we need collective instruments for taking readings and measurements. So coal pollutes more than other fossil fuels, which are more pollutant than renewable energies, etc., etc. So we can see the direction in which we must head. The speed at which we must all advance, and we're only talking about energy here, and the way this is adapted to different regions in the world will vary from time to time. You mentioned earlier on that if Europe were to help Africa, but there are many emerging countries where projects to set up less pollutant energies than coal or than fossil fuels, but which may be more dangerous to biodiversity, will pose a problem. So we need to agree that in absolute terms, nobody's perfect, but in relative terms, we're heading in the right direction. That is really important. We have to have opportunities for collective decision-taking. Then we also have to have collective readings, collective statistics. It's really difficult. I know we've heard this in another roundtable. We're all somebody else's scope 3. And so that's something which we must take into consideration. And these measurement tools are difficult to put in place. Some of you in the room may have been following this debate on extra financial reporting and standards. It's really complicated. What you described, Nicolas, about a very simple measure, takes years to be constructed. And today we are constructing that together. And in our banking, the French Banking Federation, we're working on that, not yet internationally, but in France. We want to be able to collectively measure our journeys, our itineraries. And that means that different trajectories will be different. All of the banks have signed up to Net Zero Banking Alliance, and the Federation is encouraging its members to do so, with different actions to be taken, and this demonstrates that each individual has a list of tasks to accomplish, taking into account their profession, their environment, and the transition that is required, changing the way they work with clients, for example. It's a question of aligning emissions with the trajectory which will take us towards carbon neutrality, to use credible transition scenarios that are published, and to concentrate efforts in those sectors which emit the most, whilst being attentive to transition of the entire economy. So yes, we're talking about economic changes, but also renovating homes, for example. 58% of the cost will be covered by savings, and the rest will be covered by credit and public funding. So market by market, we have to identify which actions need to be taken, and we need that thermometer. So I'm going to ask a few questions. First of all, to Madam Minister, perhaps you could tell us, because you've had a lot of international experience, perhaps you could tell us in Africa, how does the man on the street, but also the governments, how do they broach the question of sustainable development? How do they see the convergence of African economies towards sustainable development? What a great question. Africa, like the rest of the world, sees these issues of sustainable development tumbling upon its shoulders all of a sudden. Yes, Africa pollutes least because it produces less than everybody else. In Europe, we produce wealth today. But whereas it's having difficulty developing in terms of technology and science, for example, it knows that it now has to change the way it produces, so it will always be lagging behind the rest of the world. And for those among you who are familiar with Maslow's pyramid, it's really hard to ask someone to think of the global situation when on a day-to-day basis that person cannot even satisfy his or her own basic physiological needs. Africa is a great example of these new possibilities of producing differently. As the African continent does not have the heritage that we have here in Europe or in America, both north and south, in Asia also. It's easier to create something in Africa, to create something new and to produce differently than it is in a country which is highly developed already, where there may be more difficulties to change habits. It does not mean that those companies must not knuckle down to it. I think we've all said that the cost of lacking to act will be much higher than the cost of taking action. What I'm trying to say is that on the African continent, if we invest differently in human beings, in the human capital that is there, because that's where the heart of the issue is. Everything depends on the human capital. We've put human beings at the service of the economy instead of putting the economy at the service of humans. And that's what's killing us. I think we should take a look at the African continent and identify how we can produce there in a sustainable manner whilst using the science and the technology at our disposal today, because let's admit it, I think we've never had as many scientific and technical resources in order to solve all of the problems in the world, if only we would approach the subject smartly and collectively. Because today, whether we like it or not, public institutions are not working enough with private institutions. We do not have enough global data, and that means that the African continent finds it really unfair that we're asking Africa to contribute as much as those that pollute a lot, whereas it is so lagging behind in that kind of development. I've got a question now for Mr. Minister from Singapore. We all know that Singapore is a rich country, rich country that has had an amazing career path over the past 40, 50 years. It's way ahead of us all in many aspects, in terms of technology, for example. I just would like to know whether or not you're optimistic about the fact that Singapore will reach zero net emissions. You have made many commitments in Singapore, but I don't know that that is an international commitment. However, are you optimistic about the fact that you will respect all of your commitments? Are you optimistic about the fact that Singapore, which is an advanced society, will meet those objectives?
Thank you. First, if I may, we don't think ourselves as a rich country. We think ourselves as a country that keeps on trying to create a good quality of life for our people. And there's not just economics, but social policy and a larger government policy involvement. Second, I fully agree with Minister Moreno that in the end, the measure of the success must be how our policies impact on the lives of the people. Because it'll be a very hollow achievement if you have very high GDP growth, but the people do not feel the benefits of it. And that's why whatever the policy to grow has to be complemented by domestic policy that supports it. Not just in terms of training and capacity building, which I mentioned before, but also in terms of sustainability, because that is your intergenerational compact as well. Then your question is, will Singapore achieve it, and are we, am I confident? First, we have stated that we are aiming for net zero by the middle of the century. And that is a firm commitment, and for people who know Singapore, you would know that when we make these sorts of commitments, we take them very seriously. Second, I think when you make commitments like this, they must be backed up by policy, and that's key. So I'll just give you 2 or 3 examples on that. First, we have declared a price for carbon. We are taxing carbon in Singapore, and by 2030, we will be pricing carbon at between $50 to $80 a ton. That is a serious commitment. It has impact on our industries, but we are very clear that if we don't do this, the incentives will not be aligned, and importantly, we will not be able to mobilize the resources to achieve the kind of trajectory that we are seeking. Second, we have also made some very specific commitments in terms of transitions in our economy. Singapore contributes, by the way, I enjoyed your comment that everybody is somebody else's scope 3. And we are 0.1% of global emissions. So we're a very small scope 3, if you like. But we take our commitment extremely seriously, because this is a problem of the global commons, and we all have to step up. So some of the things we're doing, I'll just give you a few examples, say in the area of transportation. Land transport accounts for about 15–16% of emissions in Singapore. We have moved towards electrification. Half our public transport buses will be electric by the end of this decade. In other words, in the next 6 to 7 years. And we're also moving towards electric vehicles, and across the island we will have something of the order of 20,000 electric vehicle charging points deployed by 2025. And by the end of the decade, we expect to reach about 60,000. So that creates the infrastructure, and the government is firmly behind it, but working with the private sector in terms of the service providers. So that's just a couple of examples. We're working on sustainable aviation fuel, and also for maritime, because we're also a maritime center for ammonia and so on. But if I can bring it back to the key point, which is, I think at the end of the day, whether it is, in terms of sustainability or digitalization, we have to ensure that our small companies and businesses and our people see the value of doing this. I think if we don't connect that dot, both not just as a matter of rhetoric or policy, but also in terms of lived experience, we will not succeed in mobilizing the support of the broad mass of our people. And that is key, because it's not easy for people to fully appreciate, and I think your point was absolutely valid. If the trade-off is between meeting my basic needs or some other consequence in the future, it's a tough trade-off to make an argument at the ground level. So we have to find ways to bring these together, connect the dots, both in policy and in action, so that we're able to achieve this sustainable and inclusive economic trajectory.
Merci. Et dernière question.
Final question. For the representative of the private sector, I would like to know, you've got an international point of view, you've got subsidiaries in other countries. Do you feel in the countries in the south where you are based, do you detect real commitment to adopting this point of view of sustainable development? And how, within your group, within the group that you run, how do you feel that you can help your subsidiaries in those countries to reach their own goals, taking into account the global objective? Two very simple ideas to begin with. First of all, this isn't only a question of North versus South. I think the relationship to that transition and the questions of ESG in general is quite different from one country to the next, from one continent to the next. Our group, Sanofi, we're all over the place. We're in America, for example, and the relationship that we have to transition with our clients in the States is not at all the same relationship as we have here in Europe. So I wouldn't oppose North to South. I think this is a question where all around the world there is not the same commitment nor speed committed to the transition. That's the first point. So I think the question is not so much of saying there are continents where we're going for it and others where we're not. I think we need to accept that the pace will be different. Second component to my answer, we have solutions which we bring forward. I mentioned we've got a new management company which is really innovative. We're inventing new techniques for projects in Africa because we know that there are more risky projects which are micro projects, and so we've invented this financial tool to help those projects. Thank you very much. Paul Hudson, if you'd like to chime in there, and afterwards Philippe HEIM, and then I'll open the floor to any debate.
That will make the 30 world's most essential medicines as defined by the WHO available not for profit to the 40 poorest countries in the world. And we do it not for profit, not at a low cost. And we do it not for profit because these countries simply don't have the infrastructure to give those medicines to patients or to even have doctors or nurses to help. And I think we need to be aware of our responsibility. That for us, for example, in healthcare, you know, dropping pallets of medicines from planes in difficult countries to see them just wither away in warehouses is just not a sustainable approach to healthcare. The best thing we can do is to make sure that we're on the ground and helping the infrastructure, training doctors, nurses, pharmacists, making sure that medicines are available, making sure those that need them get them, because you know, we can't just assume we're sat here comfortably in the West and that people will figure it out themselves. We need a help.
OK. Deux phrases, Philippe HEIM, pour conclure. Oui. Parce qu'on me demande, je suis pressé par...
I'll just end up with a couple of sentences here, and this is a coherency of any action, no matter where you are. We are a business that has a mission statement. So we have got a mission, and through our insurance activities, we are a lot in Italy and Brazil, and we have been committing to fund new low-carbon projects by 2030, and that coherence is essential wherever we are based. Thank you very much. Thank you to the speakers. It's such a vast subject. We could spend all day talking about it. But the climate in the room is heating up, so that would end to it, I'm sure. Thank you.